Hi, I'm Kate Richburg, and we're here in my store, Beaducation, in San Francisco, California. And today I'm going to be teaching you about PMC. Just behind me is the classroom in our store, and we chose to give you an authentic Beaducation class experience by bringing it right here into the store. Like all big cities in San Francisco, there's a lot of traffic outside our store, and they're building a big building next door. So if you hear some hammering and some pounding, it's the guys putting up a big old building right next to our store. But let's get started talking about some PMC. I've been working with PMC since 1996, and I think it's a great material to work with. I am really passionate about this material. Let's talk a little bit about what PMC is. PMC is an organic clay that has fine silver microns mixed in. And fine silver, we'll note, is different than sterling silver. We're working with pure silver today. What happens is we shape the clay, we're going to dry the clay, file and finish the clay, and then we're going to either fire it with a torch or put it in a kiln, and the piece that we're going to get out is fine silver. I'm going to be throwing a lot of technical information at you today, a lot of tips, a lot of tricks, and if you don't feel like you catch everything, don't worry. Your handout's pretty comprehensive, so it's going to cover a lot of the things that you may miss. All right, if you're ready, let's step on back into the classroom and let's get started. Let's talk about the different types of PMC that there are. Today we're going to work with PMC Plus, but there are three types of PMC clay. First, let's talk about PMC Standard. That's the original formula of clay. It is 30% clay and 70% fine silver. It fires in the kiln for 2 hours at 1,650 degrees, and the shrinkage ratio is 30%. PMC Plus, which is what we're going to be using today, is 88% silver and 12% clay. And the shrinkage ratio is also 12%. However, we can do a lot more with the PMC Plus. We can fire it in a kiln at 10 minutes at that firing temperature, or we can use a torch to fire it, and we fire with the torch for about 2 minutes, and we're actually going to be doing that today as well. There's a third formula of clay called PMC3, and PMC3 fires at a lower firing temperature, 1,110 degrees, for about a half hour. And that allows you to mix all kinds of different things in with your PMC, including some natural stones, sterling silver, brass, and copper. PMC comes in 4 different forms. We have the regular PMC clay that you use to mold your pieces with. We have PMC slip, or some people call it paste, and that's watered down PMC, and we use that to connect 2 pieces of PMC together after they're dried or sometimes while they're still wet. We also have PMC syringe, which we use to set stones and also make designs on our finished pieces of PMC. We also have PMC sheet, or some people call it PMC paper, and we use that sometimes to make origami forms, folded freeform items, and we're going to show that as well. So what do we mean when we talk about PMC being fine silver? Fine silver is pure silver, so if you hallmarked it with a stamp, it would be hallmarked .999, which means there's nothing else mixed in with your metal. Sterling silver is an alloy. It's 92.5% silver that's mixed with 7.5% copper. And that's why sterling silver has a tendency to oxidize or tarnish. It's the copper reacting with the oxygen in the air that causes the tarnish. Fine silver, we don't have any tarnishing problems. To get started with PMC, you're going to need a few basic tools. And let me talk Here comes the saw. And whoop.
Okay, rolling. And
to get started with PMC, you're going to need to use a few basic tools. Let's start out with our roller. This is a plexiglass roller that we use to flatten the clay. We have this is what's called a wipeout tool, and it has 2 heads on either end. It's a rubber head, and we use that for kind of pushing the clay into place and tapping the clay down so it sits close together. We also have an X-Acto blade, and this craft knife blade we use to cut the clay. And we also have a long blade like so that we use to slice the clay. This is a drill that has a drill head in it. We use that for drilling holes in the clay, making holes in the clay after the clay is dried. We have some brushes, different brushes that we use to paint the slip on the clay. We have a couple of straws to use when we make our beads, or if we're using fold-over bales, we use our straws. We also have some hand salve. This salve is a non-petroleum based salve that we use on our roller and our rolling surface to prevent the clay from sticking. We'll also use this on rubber stamps and in molds to also prevent the clay from sticking. We have some playing cards taped together in different stacks. We have stacks of 4, 5, and 6 cards, and this prevents us from rolling our clay too thin. You're going to see how we use those in a minute. To file and finish our PMC, we're going to use some files and some sandpaper. We have some wet dry sandpaper in some different grits, 400, 600, and 1500. We also have just some regular nail files from the nail salon, as well as you can use these salon boards or these salon cubes here, and they make nice files for the edges of your PMC as well. For our first project, we're going to start with something that's pretty simple. We're going to make a pendant that has a rolled over bail. Here's some examples of some pendants that you're taking a look at right now. And let me talk you through just a few things, what we've got happening here. This pendant here, you can see there's a leaf texture, there's 2 stones set, as well as a texture that we've gotten from a rubber stamp. This is actually the project that I'm going to walk you through. But we have some other examples here, so let's look at a couple of variations. We have this rolled over pendant, which also features a set stone, but the stone is a little fancier with a little more embellishment here from your syringe. We've also used the PMC sheet to cut out little leaves, and those are glued onto the surface before it's fired. And we're going to talk a little bit more about PMC sheet a little later on. Here's a simpler project with just a small pendant, a simple rollover. The texture is from a texture plate, and a very simple single set stone that's there. This piece here kind of combines everything that we've got going on. We've got those leaves, again, cut from the PMC sheet, some embellishment from the syringe, the texture is from a rubber stamp, and again, another set stone with more syringe detail around it. But let's take a look at the project that we're going to be doing right now. Let's talk about some of the additional materials you're going to need for this specific project. I've got a rubber stamp here that we're going to use to make the impression at the bottom of the pendant. We've got our leaf, and this is actually a leaf that I got from a scrapbooking supply store. You use them to embellish scrapbooks or frames, that kind of thing. We've got some cubic zirconia stones here, and we've got some stone setting tweezers. I just want to talk to you a little bit about stones that you would use to put into your pieces. It's very important that the stones that you use are cubic zirconia. They need to withstand the firing temperature of the kiln at 1,650 degrees. So while you may think, oh, I can put in a little crystal, I can put in a bead, I can put in turquoise or a natural stone, it needs to be able to survive the kiln firing at 1,650 degrees. And just about the only thing that's going to do that is a cubic zirconia. To get started, I've unwrapped a fresh package of clay. This is PMC Plus, 18 grams. And from the 18 gram package, I'm going to use half of the clay for this project. If you'll notice, I have a little grid underneath my work surface here, and I use that just to help me keep my piece kind of straight, and it gives me a little reference when I am shaping my clay. And I just have a little grid that I've laminated, and I've slid it under my work surface. So I'm going to cut my clay in half, and the clay begins to dry out almost immediately as soon as it's unwrapped. So I actually use the lid from my PMC clay, from my PMC slip rather, and I put a little bit of water in that lid, and I make a little house for my clay to sit in, and that keeps it fresh until I'm ready to use it. If I am saving this piece of clay to use on a project at a later date, I'll wrap it up really well in some saran wrap, tape that saran wrap closed, and return it into its original package and close it up. But for now, for our working time, it'll be just fine underneath here. I'm going to set that aside. So here's our piece of clay that we're working with. I've used playing cards here to make sure that I don't, when I roll out my clay, that I don't roll it too thin. 5 cards, if we use our millimeter gauge, and we take our millimeter gauge and we look at that, 5 cards is it's about almost 1.5 millimeters. We don't want to make it any thinner than perhaps 5 or maybe even 4 cards, which gives us about 1 millimeter. If it's any thinner, your finished clay, if it's any thinner than this, it's going to be too fragile and your piece is going to bend. So all I've done is I've taken the cards, taped them together here at the side, and written a big number 4 on the top. You can see that here. I also have stacks of 5 cards, and sometimes I even go up to 6 cards here. But for a pendant, 5 cards is perfect. So let's get to rolling. I place my cards right next to my clay, and I put a little bit of salve on my roller, and I also want to place a little bit of salve on my work surface. Now we don't want to use so much that you've gummed up your work surface, but we want to make sure that our pieces are nice and slick so the clay isn't going to stick to them. I'm going to place my half a piece of clay in the center, and I'm going to gently roll. Now, think about if you've ever rolled out pastry dough and you don't want to roll your pastry dough into your surface so it sticks. It's the same thing with PMC. You want to gently roll your clay, and I keep moving it around so it doesn't stick. Now the beauty of this piece is that the edges and things are fairly organic, so don't worry about the edges if you have some rough edges or if you have a little rough texture surface on here. We can come back later and file that away. Now we're going to add our texture. So we've rolled out our clay, we're going to pick it up, and we're going to place our leaf, and we're going to put our piece gently on top of the leaf. And since I've used 5 cards, let me show you here. You can see how thick this piece is. We're going to thin it out just a little, but remember we don't want to thin it out anywhere any thinner than those 4 cards. So I'm going to gently roll my roller down my leaf, and if I want to spread it out a little bit, I'll gently roll it to the side and to the side. Now, this is when the magic happens. I'm going to flip this guy over and peel it away, and you can see the nice texture that I have on the surface of the clay. Now, you can see in our finished piece here, I've rolled over to make the bail. And you can see the piece that I've cut out here is a little bit longer, but again, remember this is an organic piece, so your piece is going to probably look slightly different than what we've got here up on the screen. So I'm going to make my little rollover, and perhaps I want to cut off a little bit of this clay so my pendant is a little short. And we have 2 options for cutting, but I'm going to use my thin blade here rather than my craft knife. And I'm just going to come and make a little diagonal cut just like that. This extra piece of clay I'm going to put back over into our little clay house here that we made with the lid from our slip, just to keep that moist. Now, to make a nice surface for rolling over, I'm going to use my roller and just thin that out ever so slightly. So when I flip it over, it's going to have a nice smooth roll. I'm also going to use just a little bit of plain water that's on my brush and sweep the water And sweep the, nope, let's hold. Sweep the water.
And action.
I'm going to use the brush. I have some plain water here on my paintbrush, and I'm just going to sweep this brush right across that little edge to make this moist, so when I roll this over, it's going to stick. I'm going to put my straw into position here and roll the little bail that I've made right over the top. And I'm going to use this wipeout tool, adding a little more water there, and using this tool to smooth out the bail. And stick it down. In order to move my piece around freely, sometimes I just get a little piece of cardstock here so I can slide my piece underneath it, and you can see I can rotate it around so it'll be easy for me to reach all of the angles. That way I don't have to worry about it sticking to my surface, and when I'm ready to dry this piece, I'll just be able to pick this up and transfer it over to my drying station. So, you can see right here, there's a little bit of nicking or marking on my surface. Again, I can just use my water to smooth that out. I can also use my PMC paste. Get a little bit of that watered down paste and fill it in as well. Now, I want to recommend not to do too much nudging and moving around of your piece when it's wet. At this stage, when it's still wet, the clay is really pliable, and if you move it around or play with the edges a little too much, it's going to come out of shape. So you really want to make sure to just get in, fix it up just as much as you like it, and then let it dry. And we're going to take the next steps from there after it's dry. What I do want to mention is to make sure that this connection of your bail is firmly adhered down, because when this piece finally goes into the kiln, remember it's going to shrink about 12%, because remember we're using PMC Plus. It's going to shrink about 12%, and in the kiln as it shrinks, this piece may lift if it's not completely adhered down. So just get your paste or your water and just go along the seam to make sure it's nice and connected. A couple more swipes with my brush. I have a tendency to want to overwork things, so I need to stop using this brush right now. So let's put this aside and let's talk a little bit about drying your piece. Right in front of you, you can see this is a coffee warmer. And you perhaps may have been in your office and received an office gift from your office mate of a coffee warmer, and you think, my goodness, am I ever going to use this for my coffee? The answer is really no. But you are going to use it for your PMC. We're going to switch this on, and we can transport our PMC piece right onto our coffee warmer and let it sit, I'd say, for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to flip it over and let it dry on the other side for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to check it and see if it's dry. Let's talk a little bit about PMC paste, because the PMC paste is a really important formula of the clay, and you're going to use this paste a lot. As I said earlier, the paste glues, we use it like glue to adhere two pieces of dry clay together, also to smooth out any cracks or imperfections in your clay. And once you have one jar of PMC paste, that's all you're ever going to need to buy. The cool thing about PMC is it's ultimately recyclable. I have here this little filings that I've filed off of finished pieces of PMC, and what I can do is I can just add those little filings right into my PMC container and add a little more water. I'm actually gonna I'm going to add a little more water in there and reconstitute my PMC. And you can do that as well if when you're ready to work with your clay and you open up your paste jar and you see that everything's dried up, just add some water and mix it around. The consistency of paste, you want it, sometimes I have it a little bit, I don't know, maybe a little bit like pudding, a little bit like glue, nothing too thin, but we don't want it too thick either. So remember, every little bit of PMC that you file off, cut off, or comes off of your pieces, as long as it's unfired, it can go right into your jar. We also want to make sure, though, to have separate jars. If you're using different formulas of PMC, we want those to go in their very own slip jars. So our PMC Plus only has PMC Plus in it, our PMC 3 only has PMC 3 in it, and of course our PMC Standard only has PMC Standard in it. So now that our piece is dried, we can slide it off of the little piece of cardstock paper and take a listen. I hope you can hear this, but take a listen and you'll know it's dry. Can you hear that noise? That means that our clay is dry. It starts to have kind of a dry kind of little noise when you drop it down against your surface. But you want to be careful. We don't want to be too rough with the clay at this point because this is when the clay is at its most fragile. So, once our clay is dry, we're going to be able to remove that straw. And we might return this a little bit later after maybe we refine some of these edges and stuff. We might return it to the coffee warmer to continue drying, but for now it's dry enough for us to work with it. So we've taken our straw out of our piece and we're going to add the detail onto our dried piece of PMC. If you'll remember, the original piece had a nice little detail here of a flower, and we're actually going to make that detail with a separate piece of clay. You could also, after you rolled the leaf onto the surface, you could have also textured that to the clay, but this step is going to show you how you would adhere a second piece of PMC on top of a dried piece. So I'm going to set my original leaf aside, and we're going to bring in a small little piece of PMC clay, and we're going to roll that out using a 4-card stack. Now I'm going to bring my rubber stamp into position, and don't forget to add a little bit of salve onto that surface so that our clay won't stick. And we're not worrying about thinning this piece up too much because remember, we're going to stack this on top of our finished piece. So it can be a little bit thinner than the 4 cards when we roll it out. Now, the way I like to use a rubber stamp, if you'll notice, I've set the stamp upside down with the top facing up, and I'm just going to use my roller and come right down on my piece and give it a little roll. I also might give it a little tap with my fingers to make sure that the image is transferring right onto my piece. Then I'm going to flip it over right onto my piece of cardstock and pull the stamp back. But let's cut this piece down using my straight blade. The straight blade really gives me a nice clean edge, so I don't have to do really any filing on this at all. This piece using the edge of my knife. And where I'm going to place this piece, I'm going to place it right here and kind of give the place where I'm going to set it a little dampening with my brush. And you see how the water, I'm just using plain water. The water is kind of creating its own little slip. So I don't need to actually add slip, I'm just adding water. I'm going to come in, whoops, fling my piece. I don't want to fling it. Use my craft knife or my blade and coax it gently right into position. Now, I'm going to use one of my very favorite tools, this wipeout tool. Well, first I'm going to use my finger. Then I'm going to use my wipeout tool to help me push all of the edges down. Because remember, if it's not connected, when it goes in the kiln, it's going to raise up as it shrinks. Now we're going to set in our stones. So now we're going to set a stone on our PMC piece, and we're going to use the syringe to do that. And to prepare your syringe, we're going to take off this little red tip off of the tip of the syringe, and we want to put that aside to use again later. If we don't use up all of the clay in this syringe, we just recap the syringe and it's ready to be used at a later date. But I'm going to take this off right now, set that aside. And the syringe comes with this little tip that goes on it. And what you're going to do is, I prefer when we're setting a stone to have the clay, when it extrudes out of the tip, to be a little bit fatter. So what I do is I actually take my craft knife here and I just make a little tiny cut, and you can probably hardly even see what that looks like, but that gives you a little fatter of a tip. Let me take that back. So I've cut. So that makes the hole in the tip a little bit larger, so when you extrude the clay out, you get a nice fatter circle. So I'm going to push that right aside, and we're going to put this tip on. And you want to really put that on like you mean it, because when you push the plunger down on the syringe, you don't want the syringe to pop right off. So we're going to push the clay right down here. Push the clay right down. I'm going to bring this piece back in, and you can see I'm just going to make a little line here with my syringe. And you can see how the syringe comes right out. So now let's set the stones. We're going to first make the holes for the stones in the piece. Since we're using cubic zirconia, and the cubic zirconia have a point back like this, there needs to be a hole in your piece of clay so that point can sit right in that little hole. Plus there's light behind the stone, and that'll help that stone sparkle. So I'm going to use this little hand drill, and the hand drill is going to make the hole right in my piece of clay. Now this piece of clay has been dried, and I prefer to make my holes after the clay is dried, because if this piece were wet, number one, I couldn't really handle it like this without it flopping all over the place. And if I went to make my hole might distort the rest of this piece. So we wait until it's dry, and it'll be much easier to put that hole through the piece. So I have my drill with my drill bit in it, and this is just a little hand drill, and we're going to make the hole just by doing this twisting motion with the drill. So I put it right where I've made my little mark, and I'm going to support my piece of PMC with my hand and just let the drill do its work. You don't have to have a lot of force behind it, but just enough so that the drill feeds right through. Okay, and there I am through, and you can see here on the back, just do a little scrapey and make sure it's gone all the way through. Let's do our second one. Place our drill bit. We've popped through there. Clean it up on the back a little. And we've gotten our two holes. Now, remember all of this little scraping that we have here, or all the little bits that have come out of our drill, or of the hole rather that we've drilled? Do you remember where that goes? That's right, it goes right back into your cup with the slip. So I'm going to put that on my blade, and I'm going to put that into my slip jar. Okay, so let's make these holes just a little bit larger here, because we need to have the stone sit down a little more flush onto your piece. So you can see really just the tip, that stone sits in that hole, but we want it to sit down a little bit further. So I'm going to enlarge that hole a little bit using the tip of my craft knife. And I do that really carefully by just inserting the tip of the craft knife in the hole and just rotate it gently around. That's going to make your hole just a little bit larger. Here's my syringe, and we're going to use the syringe to make the walls of the bezel. And again, the clay is dry, so I'm going to add just a touch of water around this hole, so when I extrude the syringe, the clay out of the syringe, it's going to have something to stick to. So just put some pressure on the plunger of the syringe, and you can see the little piece of clay coming out right there. And when I make my bezel around the hole here, see what a long lead I have on that? It allows me to control my little ribbon of clay a lot better. And I'm going to build this little wall up, I would say about 4 rounds. And it's just slightly smaller than my stone. Now if my little lead breaks, like it just did, I'm going to use my tweezer. I'm just going to set it right back into place. Don't worry so much about keeping the syringe super perfect, because you can coax it into place a little bit later. But we're going to keep going. Just add in that clay where we left off and bring it around. Sometimes you need 2 hands to guide the syringe. You know, the syringe does take a little bit of practice. I'm making it look really, really easy. It's going to be easy for you once you get a little bit of practice in. So you can see, and I'm going to turn this way so you can see what's going on here. See my little stack? What I need to make sure that happens at this point is that all of my clay that I've made this little bezel out of is completely connected, not only one little snake against the other, but this whole piece really connected to the base of my PMC. So I'm just going to gently use my finger and tap that down. If my little snake came out of kilter here, I'll just grab it, put it back on. We want to work with clay that's had a moment to dry. Tappity tappity, gently down. Okay? So now comes the moment of truth. We're going to grab our stone with our stone setting tweezers, point up, flip it, drop it into the little round we made with the PMC syringe. I'm going to make it even by just tapping gently with the tip of my tweezer. And I'm going to tap it right into place. And the bezel that you made should come up and over the sides of the stone. We're going to gently coax the edges using our wipeout tool. Now it's also really important, I have a tendency to overwork this bezel. To overwork this bezel when I'm doing this. So I want to push it in, and then I want to let it sit. I really want to leave it alone because, again, I want to wait till this dries, and then I can come in with my sandpaper or my brush, make sure that everything is connected down here. But for the moment, let me just tap that little part down. For the moment, I'm going to let this sit. Let's do the second stone. For the second stone, I'm going to repeat what I did the first time around. Extrude out a little bit of clay. place it on my pendant and just go right around the hole. I'm going to go a little more quickly this time. And that little part that's lumpy there, don't worry, remember how we tapped it down? That's all going to tap down. And you guys, don't be afraid of the syringe. The syringe takes some practice. And if you do a bezel and you don't love it and you feel like it really looks awful and it's not coming out like you like it, let it dry just a little bit. Try not to fuss with it too much. And once it's fairly dry, you can use your tweezers or your fingernail and just flick it right off the surface, put it in your slip jar, and start again. So no stress, okay? Okay, we're gonna connect that down. We're gonna pause for a moment to let it settle, to let it dry just a little. Now, as I turn this around, you can really see the sides of the bezel. It's not that perfect. It's kind of leaning. One side is higher than the other. That's all okay, because when we press that stone down, it's all going to even out. You can also use, if you feel like your bezel has flopped over just a little bit, use the tip of your wipeout tool and gently coax it open like that. If you let your clay dry for just a couple of moments, it'll be easier to handle that way. All right, we're going to pop in stone number 2. Drop it into our bezel. We want to make sure that our stone is level. See how my stone is leaning a little bit to the side? So I'm going to tap it in there. So in theory, it should be nice and straight. And we're going to tap with the tip of our tweezer, and the sides of the clay are going to come up and around. Now, on this side right here, you can see the edge of the stone is exposed. In order for the stone to stay in the setting, the clay has to come up and around over that edge of the stone. So I'm going to just come in and add a little more PMC right there. Extrude my clay. Place it where I think I want my little extra to start. Bring it around. Let me turn that towards you so you can really see there's that little bit that I've added. I'm going to pause for just a moment to let it settle in. And I can tap using my finger or my wipeout tool. Sometimes I think your finger's the best tools for this job. And now I'm going to stop fooling around with that and let it sit. So it's time to clean up the edges on our pendant. And I have some filing tools that I want to show you before we get started. This is a regular emery board, one that you would get at any beauty supply store, as well as a sanding block, also from the beauty supply. They're not really heavy grits. You don't want to sand anything with anything too coarse on your PMC. We're just looking to smooth the edges and smooth out little imperfections that might have happened in the clay. I also have some sandpaper. It's called wet dry sandpaper because it can be used either wet or dry. In this case, we're going to use it dry. And this is a fine grit. This is about 1500. I use them in grades of 400, 600, and 1500. Usually they're available at any auto supply store or usually your hardware store. So to get started with filing, I am going to work on the sides of my piece here. Now what I do before I begin to file is I rub my finger down the side of the piece and I feel if anything is extremely sharp in my clay. Because imagine once it's metal, that sharpness is really going to be an issue. So we want to make sure that we're smoothing down anything that might be too sharp when we take this piece out of the kiln. So I'm going to come in with my file, and I'm just going to gently rub that side piece. I like to round the sides of my piece just a little bit so it gives it a nice clean edge. And we're going to wipe that excess away. And now when I run my finger down this side, it feels really smooth. And you can compare this side, any of that little cracking that we might have had, you can see I still have some of that over here, and I can really feel I have an edge, a pretty big edge there. So I'm just going to gently take that down with my file. I'm going to file a little bit here. Now, if you have a crack at all in your piece, a little surface crack, you can see there's some right there where the clay folds over. I can come in and file that down. It's a little ridge back here too. I'm going to file that down. But if you feel like there's too much cracking and your file isn't getting you anywhere, you can use your slip and paint just a very thin layer and that's going to help smooth things out. Now on the front, you can see there's some texture that I don't think I want on this pendant. I'm going to use this little sanding sponge. This little sanding sponge also you can get in the paint section of your hardware store. They're usually for taking paint off of whatever you want to take paint off of. But they have a super fine grit on them. But anything that you're comfortable with sanding, again, the sandpaper would work well here. You can also cut up your little emery boards into smaller pieces. Whatever works for you to file. Everybody has their own preference, I think, on how they smooth out their PMC. But you can see, as I wipe the excess clay away, how that's starting to really smooth out. And the finishing techniques for your PMC, the more you really pay attention to how smooth things are, how nice the things look on the edges, you know, making sure to take care of your little cracks, making sure the sides and the back look as nice as the front does. That's going to really affect the quality of your finished piece. So take some time, though sometimes the filing can be a little tedious. We want our finished result to be as nice as it can be. And you can see I'm just now starting to sand in circles right here so I don't leave any telltale marks on with my sanding. We'll brush that away. And you can see it's really starting to look pretty smooth. Okay. Now the edges of this little applique that I put on the top, I might want to take those down just a little bit. I can use this sanding sponge, or I can come in with my piece of wet dry sandpaper and see how I folded it into a little point like so. That little point I can use to just gently sand the edge of that piece so it looks pretty nice. And the secret when we're sanding is you don't want to come in and try and take everything off in one stroke. You just want to gently go back and forth and repeat that process as much as you need until it looks like you want it to look. Now the last thing we have here are our stones. And remember, they're cubic zirconia, so the stones are nice and hard. So you're not going to scratch them by using this wet dry sandpaper. So let's say that you've been setting your stone, and there's clay on the face of your stone. You need to make sure and take that off before you fire it in the kiln or with your torch, because if the piece is fired and there's silver on your stone, that silver's going to stick. So there's a little bit of clay residue on my stone here, so I'm going to use that little point of my sandpaper to come in and sand that away. And then I'm just going to gently file and clean up my stone here. But a gentle touch. We also want to check the sides of our stones to make sure that there aren't any gaps between where the bezel meets the base of our pendant. So as I turn it and I check the edges, if there's any little gapping, I take my small brush and I use my PMC slip and I just make sure that everything is connected. Because again, if it's not connected, when we fire it, as it shrinks, the bezel will lift. So I just continue to sand my bezel, make everything nice and smooth. Once that's done, we're ready to fire the piece. Our next project is going to be some rolled beads, or you can also call them sliders, and they're fun to string on necklaces or bracelets. And you can see there's a variety of beads here that I've created. Some have set stones in them here. You can see more set stones here. And these have just have little round balls set on them. Some of them are more shiny, some of them have been oxidized darker, and some don't have any oxidation at all. So this is a really free-form project, so whatever you come up with is going to look terrific. So to begin, I've used about a half of my lump of 18-gram clay, and I've rolled it to a thickness of 4 cards, and I'd like some texture on the outside of my bead, so I'm going to use one of these brass texture plates, and I'm just going to rub a little bit of salve on that so my clay doesn't stick. I'm going to pick up my clay, lay it gently down on the texture plate, and lightly, the operative word here, kids, is lightly, roll the clay into the texture plate. Now I'm really just pressing the clay in. I'm not elongating it much. Remember, we don't want to make anything thinner than about 4 cards or it's going to be too thin. But since this is a bead that's going to be rolled on top of itself, it's going to give it a little more strength. So if your clay is a little thinner, it's not the end of the world. All right, let's check our texture and see what that looks like. I'm going to gently pick it up here. Let's flip it over onto our card, and you can see indeed I do have my texture all taken care of right here. I'm going to flip this piece of clay onto my hand, and I'm going to get my piece of drinking straw, and I'm just going to roll the bead right around the straw. Now I have this little flap here. I'm just going to use some plain water and paint the water just under the flap and stick that flap down. Now I have a little bit of extra clay here, and sometimes I like to curve my clay back to make the bead look a little bit interesting. So I'm going to curve that back. Maybe this time add a little bit of slip under that curve. And just have my brush help me make a nice little curved shape. Let's get our wipeout tool. Just ignore that cracking, we'll take care of it later. Think organic. There we go. So shape it into any type of shape that pleases you. You can see here's the fold. Here's the back of the fold. The edges are a little rough, but we're not going to play around with those too much. We're going to let those dry. Okay, so while the bead I just made is drying, I'm going to show you an alternate stone setting method on this bead that I made earlier that's already dry. Here we have a large cubic zirconia and two little round balls that I made using fine silver wire with my torch. And when we get to torch firing, I'm going to actually show you how to make those little balls, so hang tight with those. But the way we're going to stone set this larger stone is I'm going to actually remove the tip off of my syringe. I'm going to place this tip in my water cup so it doesn't dry out. I'm just going to drop that right into there. And I sometimes like to set a stone right in the fold of the bead, or you can set one right here, anywhere you think a stone might look nice. But I'm going to go for it right there. So we'll add a little bit of water right here because this bead's pretty dry and we want our clay to be able to stick. So a little bit of water there. Get our syringe, and we've taken the tip off, remember, and we're just going to extrude the clay so you have a nice little mound of clay. And we want that mound to be a little bit larger than the stone. I'm going to add a little bit of that right there. Place your syringe back in your water cup. I'm just going to gently tap this in. Now I'm going to pick up my stone, point side up, flip, and press it right into that little mound of clay that you've just made. And we're going to tap, tap, tap that stone right in. Now you can see it's kind of widened the clay out here, but that's no big deal, as we're going to get our trusty wipeout tool. We're going to gently coax the bezel around the stone. Now remember, we can use our finger to push that in. If we don't have quite enough clay here, we can see the edge of that stone, and we don't want to see the edge or that stone's going to fall out. We're going to take a syringe that has a syringe tip on it, and we're just going to extrude a little snake of clay. Again, see this long lead I've got on here? Bring that around. Okay, we're going to let that sit for a moment. You can see how there's a gap there? That gap can't be there, or else it's just going to lift. So I'm going to let it sit for a moment and gently tap that into place with my finger. There we go. It's really gone in the place that we need it to be. Use your wipeout tool. I'm going to just coax that clay right off the stone. You're going to develop a pretty light touch with the syringe. Don't be too daunted. With the syringe, it'll become your friend soon enough. Okay. Practice, practice, practice. A little bit of water here, and the water is going to just smooth everything out, blending that line, blend that line, blend. I'm going to turn, blend. This is what I call the blob method, for lack of a better name, but the blob method actually is a little bit easier than doing that syringe method where we made the little walls of clay and then pushed the stone in. Though this blob method doesn't allow you to have any light behind the stone, because if we put a hole in here, the blob would just plug it up. And also it makes your bezel a lot larger. But for a bead like this, I think it actually looks kind of nice. That bezel is kind of grounded on this piece. And again, if I'm getting any clay on the stone, not a big deal. We're going to let it dry, and then we'll file it away with our wet dry sandpaper. I'm using the tip of the brush, can you see that here, where I'm just pushing the bezel back just a little to expose a little more of the stone. And you can see this teeny little brush I'm using. The brush is pretty dry. There's not much water on this at all. And the brush just can really get in there in detail. I'm going to turn that around, and I'm going to do that same thing right here on this side. And as we've been chatting, the bezel has been drying a little bit, so it makes it a little bit easier for me to control the clay. If the bezel was really wet, there's no way I could do this without smearing the bezel all over everything. Okay, I'm going to add the little silver balls that I've made, and then we're going to do a little bit of decoration with our syringe as well. So I'm going to extrude a little bit of clay, just someplace for the little ball to sit. Pick that little ball up with my stone setting tweezers and tap it into place. Let's do another one right next to it. And kids, there's a little bit of, as we said earlier, San Francisco is a city that's constantly being built up. Well, they sure are building next door, so if you hear some hammering, that's the building that's going up. Little bit of syringe. Tap that ball right into place. Now, we could leave this kind of plain. We can come back in, of course, and clean it up a little, but let's add a little bit of decoration to our piece. So we're just going to extrude a little bit of clay here, and the syringe will cover up a multitude of sins here if you feel like your bezel isn't all that it should be. So I'm just going to extrude the clay, just doing whatever I feel looks kind of nice. So you can see how that edge right there, the clay hasn't been connected. So I'm going to let that sit for just a moment, then I'm going to push that down with my finger, because if we leave this like this little syringe is just too thin to survive on its own. It needs to be connected down. So I'm going to come in with my finger, hopefully it's dry, and gently tap that little syringe down so it connects. Okay, so we've got a little fancy bit from our syringe. We've got our little silver balls here. We've got our nice big stone. I'm going to let this dry completely, and then I would sand it up nicely here so it's nice and smooth. Remove any of the silver that happens to be on the stone, and then that'll be ready for firing as well. While we were setting that other stone, this bead has really dried pretty well. So I'm going to slide it off the straw, and you can tell when the piece is dry because the straw will move freely. If you pick your piece up off the hot plate and you can't quite get the straw out, that means it hasn't dried yet. But this looks like it's nice and dry, so I'm going to pull that straw out, and you can see I've got a little bit of a rough edge here, a little bit of a rough edge here, a little bit of cracking here. And just like we did with the pendant, we're going to use our sanding board and just gently clean those edges. And if I feel like it's a little too deep, I can add a little bit of slip to fill that in. And I like my fold over on my bead to be nice and smooth as well. So I'm just going to continue with that slip right up on the fold. And that's ready for a stone, or to just leave it plain on its own. Our next project, we're going to learn how to use PMC sheet, also known as PMC paper. And the paper is a terrific product, and you can see I've used it to embellish these pendants. It comes around here, molds up here on this piece, and it's right around here on this piece, as well as these little leaf cutouts. Those are also made of PMC paper. So we're going to start by making our base of our pendant and embellishing. So to begin this project, I've used half of an 18-gram piece of clay and cut it out to a thickness of 5 cards. And I have a big old rubber stamp here that I'm going to take my texture from. Now I put a little bit of salve onto the stamp where I want to take the image. And remember, we don't want a ton of salve, we just want enough so the clay won't stick. We're going to lay our clay gently down on our rubber stamp, and we're going to mold, rather we're going to roll our clay. And it's going to get a little bit thinner, but we don't want it to get much thinner, which is why I used my 5 cards, because as we roll, we'll probably thin it down to about a 4 card thickness. So let's pick it up. Take a look at our image. Our image looks pretty darn good. And we're going to use our slicing blade to cut out a square. Now if you have a square template, you can use that. If you have a little square shape cutter, you can use that. But I'm going to freehand it by using my blade to give me a nice square shape. Just like so. My little pieces, remember our friend the clay house, they're going to go right back underneath for our next project. Now that our piece is dry, and remember we talked about that little noise. It sounds dry when it is dry, obviously it's rigid, but you just want to hear that little noise and you know that that piece is dried. And this is dried for maybe about 5 minutes or so. It doesn't take that long for this thin piece to dry. If your edges are at all rough, we can do a little bit of filing, but that flat blade really gave me some nice clean edges, so I don't have too much to clean up at this point. Now I'm going to start by putting my PMC sheet kind of in a free-form manner on the base of this pendant. So the PMC sheet comes in a package here, and we're going to open this package up. And the thing about PMC sheet is that it's formulated a little bit differently than the clay. So the PMC sheet is an oil-based clay, so it doesn't dry out as quickly as this water-based PMC might. So here's the sheet out of the package, and you can see it's really flexible. But I can leave it out of the package like this all day and it wouldn't dry out. So you don't have to worry about rushing with this. What we can do with this PMC sheet, it's really thin. So if I just put this sheet in the kiln or fired it with the torch, it would be too thin to stand on its own. So it needs to be backed with something. You can see I can rip the sheet to have a nice ripped edge that I can use. I can also use this paper punch. This is a paper punch that we use for scrapbooking or other little paper crafts. And with that little punch, what I can do is I can put my piece of PMC right into my paper punch here. and I'm going to punch out a couple of little leaves. And I'll be able to use these to embellish my pendant. And you can see that paper punch gives us some really nice detail on that leaf. I'm going to move it onto this card here so you can really see what that looks like. And the little piece of sheet that I tore off earlier, we're going to use that to embellish. I've used, or the way I'm going to connect this sheet to the plate of my pendant, I'm going to use some gel glue. Now the gel glue, I'm taking it out of the bottle here. The brand that I'm using is an Elmer's. This is a very old bottle, but I'll show you here. It's the Elmer's School Glue Gel. I've also used just regular glue stick to do this as well. But since this is an oil-based clay, we don't want to use slip or water to add your pieces to your pendant back, or else the PMC paper is going to break down. So we need to use some kind of glue, and this gel glue or glue stick I've had the best results with. And when the paper is adhered to the base of your pendant, the sintering process in the kiln, everything adheres really nicely. So I start with my little ripped sheet and I decide where I might want to begin attaching. So I'm going to paint a little bit of glue on the bottom and on the top. Now kids, you want to think loose and organic. Don't overthink this. Just let the paper fold how you think it should go. Adding a little bit of glue, not huge amounts, but just a little, and then using that to stick over on itself. I've also seen artists use this for origami paper folding with the PMC. So there's all kinds of things you can do with this sheet. Just remember, it needs to either be folded back on itself several times in order to be durable, or it needs to be adhered to a base. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of glue wherever I feel it needs a little extra sticking. Use your brush to coax everything into place. Remember, the PMC does not like to be rushed. So work at a pretty mellow pace here. Because remember, the sheet, it doesn't have water in it, so it's not going to dry out. So we're not racing against time like maybe we would be otherwise. So coax everything into place until you're pretty happy with your design. And I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with my design. And I'm just going to go right to the next step. I'm not going to wait for this glue to dry. You can if you want, but we're actually going to put our set stone in, and then we're going to add our leaves. So I'm just going to move right to that. We're going to use the same method as we did on the bead to extrude a little blob of clay right out of our tipless syringe. And that little tower of PMC, we're going to push that right down using our tweezer. Grab my stone. In this case, it's this trillion cut here. We're going to flip it over. We're going to flip it over one more time. There we go. Third time's a charm on this, kids. We're going to flip it over. There we go. And press that in. tappity tappity. And place the stone wherever you like it, you know, wherever you think it goes. You're the jewelry designer. Coax it in with your trusty fingernail tool. Okay. Or you can use your friend in mind, the wipeout tool. There we go. Now let's embellish a little bit with our syringe to make this a little fancier, though you could leave it just as is. The glue that's on the base of this pendant is going to help my syringe also stick. So I'm just going to kind of free form it here with the syringe. And remember, the syringe covers a multitude of sins on your bezel. So you can see I've just done that there. And I'm going to come around on this side, squeeze, hope that my syringe cooperates with me. And you know what, if you feel like it's not cooperating and we've got this going on, get rid of it with your trusty tweezer. Okay. And we're going to give it another go. Just like that. And if you want to go over the stone a little bit, you can do that too with your syringe. You may be thinking, just like cake decorating. And you'd be right. Just like cake decorating. Remember, we talked about earlier, any little syringe bits that are sticking up, we need to push them down gently. So I'm going to use my finger to gently coax those into place. Now I've got some space here, and I'm going to add my little leaves to that space. I'm going to pick up, I'm actually going to put this leaf on my finger, paint my glue all along the back of my leaf. Very carefully pick it up in my trusty tweezer. Tapping that into place, making sure that all the little leaf ends are connected. Let's add one more. Paint, paint, paint. And any residue that the glue is going to leave is going to burn away in the kiln. When this piece actually starts to dry, the glue actually starts to turn a color. You kind of get a little brown color around where you've added the glue, but don't be alarmed, all of that's going to go away in the kiln. Okay, we're going to let that dry, and I'm going to attach a bail onto the back of this piece. To make the bail for the back of the piece, I've rolled up the scrap that I cut away from my pendant, and I've rolled it at a 5-card thickness. And I'm going to use my straight blade to cut a couple of strips out of the clay. And these are good little component parts to make with your extra clay. We have a little bit of scrap left. Goes back under our lid. And I'm going to work with this thicker one to start. Put this one aside for just a moment. I'm going to even up the end on each end of the clay. And I'm going to cut this in half. Now a bail for the back of the piece is curved. So we want to get our drinking straw and we're going to dry these over the drinking straw so they dry in a curve. Just like so. And about 5 minutes of drying time on your hot plate should be about enough. Once our bail is dry, we're going to clean up the sides and also the contact points where it's going to hit your pendant. So I'm just going to file it nice and smooth on the bottom, turn it to the side, file it nice and even, turn it to the other side, and file it nice and even. File it on the back. So everything is nice and smooth. And we're ready to attach this bail to the back of our pendant. Now that both pieces are dry, we're going to connect our bail to the back of our pendant. We're going to turn it over. And the way I like the placement of my bail, if it's too far in the middle, like this, the piece may have a tendency to flop forward. It might be a little top heavy. So I'm going to place it in the upper third of our piece. Now, just a note here, you can size this bail to be as large or as small as you want. I like a larger bail because sometimes I like to put pieces like this on cord. So whatever size you make the bail, keep in mind how you want to use it when it's actually a finished piece. So I'm going to get some slip.
I have a question. The camera and action.
So I'm going to add my slip to each of the little ends of this bail. And kids, when I was talking about the sizing of the bail, you also want to keep in mind the shrinkage ratio of this clay. Remember, we're using PMC plus, so the shrinkage ratio is about 12%. So you don't want to make your bail gigantic, but you also want to remember it's going to shrink down a little bit in the kiln. So I'm going to grab onto my bail with my tweezers, and I'm going to place it right at the top. I'm going to show you the side view so you can see how this goes in. I'm just going to use my finger and press it into the back, hopefully in the center. Now you can see I've got some extra clay kind of oozing out the sides here. What I want to do first is get a little bit of water, just a little bit of water on my brush, not too much. And just use that little bit that's kind of oozing out to help me adhere the clay, or rather adhere the bail onto the back of the clay. The slip I used was pretty thick. I'm going to get right in the interior of that bail with the tip of my brush and make sure that the inside is completely connected. Because if it isn't, during firing, when it shrinks, it'll lift. Now, one last little dip of my brush in my water. I'm going to smooth everything out and back. So I'm blending all of my little brush strokes that I've just put in so that the back of the pendant will look as nice and as polished as the front of your pendant. I'm going to let this dry once more and just going to smooth the back of the bail. And after we let that dry, if I need to file it just lightly to smooth everything out, I can. I'm going to add a little hole here at the bottom of my pendant, and the placement of my hole needs to be a little in from the edge. I don't want to drill too close to the edge, or that hole is going to be a little too fragile and it may break. But you can see there's the hole. We'll turn it around. If there's a little bit of residue left, we'll just scrape that away with the tip of our drill. But now we'll be able to dangle a bead or something here on the bottom of our pendant as well. This is all ready for firing. Let's take a look at all of our completed projects that we've worked on. We have our leaf pendant with the fold-over bail. We have our 2 rolled beads, a plain one and an embellished one. We also have our pendant with the bail on the back and the PMC paper embellishing. So these pieces have all been dried. They've been refined. The edges have been sanded. The stones have been cleaned. We've made sure everything is nice and smooth. So these are all ready for firing. We have a couple of options with firing. Now again, remember this is PMC Plus, so we can fire in 2 ways. We can use the kiln, and it would fire at 1,650 degrees, and we'd hold that temperature for about 10 minutes. The whole firing cycle in a kiln takes about an hour. With the torch, we would fire with a handheld butane torch, and the torch, we would hold that temperature for 2 minutes when we fire with the torch, but the whole torch process takes about 4 minutes. We've got to bring the piece up to temperature. We have to see that the piece glows, and then we hold that temperature for 2 minutes as it's firing. I'm going to demonstrate both of the techniques for you. First, let's take a look at the kiln. Okay, here we are over at the kiln, and my kiln is a pretty well-loved kiln. I've been doing PMC for almost, well, 10 years, 8 years, a while, let's just say. And my kiln has seen me through many of those years of firing PMC. So if you're relatively new to PMC, you'll probably purchase yourself a nice, bright, shiny new kiln, but eventually it will start to look like my old and well-loved kiln. So to load the kiln, you can load the kiln a couple of different ways. We have 2 different options to fire in the kiln. First, this is a kiln shelf. You could also use a solderite board or a similar shelf that we might put in the kiln. And this is a flat surface here, so we would just lay our PMC pieces flat. This piece that has the bail on the back, we would set face down so the bail is facing up so it wouldn't be damaged during the firing process. But it's not the best choice when you're firing something that has dimension to it. What I find that works really well is we can use this terracotta saucer that you would use for a planter. And in the terracotta saucer, we have some vermiculite. Vermiculite is a form of mica that you would use to aerate your potting soil. And vermiculite can be found in any garden supply, or sometimes hardware stores also carry it. You would take your pendant and you can nestle it in the vermiculite, either face down, or you can turn it and we can nestle the bail right inside there. And we can take our beads and also nestle them into the saucer. And those are ready for the kiln. So we want to fire it at 1650, and we want to hold that temperature for a minimum of 10 minutes. Now you can go all the way up to 2 hours without overfiring your pieces. Kilns really vary. This kiln, the brand is actually Paragon, but many different companies make different kilns specifically for PMC use. And all of those kilns come with pretty good directions, so you can refer to the directions for your particular kiln, but they mostly work the same way. The way that we program this particular kiln, I'm going to start by hitting this green button, and it says here full speed, which is what I want. It says 1110, and it says 1110 because the other day I was firing PMC 3. So we're going to raise that temperature to 1650. And we watch it climb. Once it hits 1650, or close thereabouts, we're going to push it back down. We don't want to go over 1650 because 1650 is very close to the melting temperature of fine silver. So we don't want to raise it beyond that, or else we're going to take out little blobs of melted PMC rather than the beautiful pieces that you made. So we're going to continue through the cycle of our kiln. I'm holding for 32 minutes. Again, that was for our PMC 3. So I'm going to lower the time that my kiln is holding to 10 minutes. My kiln, my particular brand of kiln, asks me if I'm ready. I'm ready. You seem to be ready. So let's start. And we're going to see the temperature come up. And we heard the kiln click on. And we're going to see the temperature start to rise. Now, the whole firing cycle, as I said earlier, is going to take about an hour. It's going to cycle up to 1650. It's going to hold that 1650 for 10 minutes. And then when your kiln is done, it'll ring. You'll turn the kiln off and let the kiln cool, and your pieces will all be ready to go. Okay, now we're going to fire with our torch. And the torch we're going to use, this particular brand of torch is called Blazer, and this is a butane torch. And I want to talk to you a couple of things about a torch. You may have a torch laying around that you might use for creme brulee, or you might have taken a simple metalsmithing class and have a torch. The one thing that you really want to think about when you're purchasing a torch, see how the top of this torch, there's a lot of metal in this torch here. Since we have the torch on for such an extended period of time, the more metal the torch has on it, the longer lasting this torch is going to be. If you have a torch that's a fairly inexpensive one that has a lot of plastic up here, the heat from the torch, because we have to keep it on so long, is going to float back up here to this plastic component, and this part is may actually start to melt on you. So I would suggest buy the best torch that you can afford. You'll be really pleased with the results. And notes about the torch, notes also about the firing times, those are also in your materials packet. So don't stress about taking so many notes. All of it's already written down for you. Okay, so we're going to turn the torch on. And let me actually take that back. If we need to fill your torch, usually butane torches have a little opening at the bottom. This is butane fuel with a little stem. And the way that you fill your torch is you put your butane stem into the bottom of the torch and press. And I usually count to about 10 as I'm filling, or you can see as the piece is filling, or as the torch rather is filling, once it's full, you're going to get a little bit of sputtering around the stem. Right on cue, there it goes. Okay? So that's how we know our torch is full. We're going to set our butane canister aside and put our torch upright and let the gas settle for just a moment. I have a kitchen timer here, and we're going to use the kitchen timer to actually time how long we're going to be firing. So let me talk to you a little bit about what you're going to be seeing. Here's our piece. We're going to turn our torch on. We're going to bring the torch around the piece really lightly to start to gradually heat the piece. You're going to actually see the PMC piece start to flame. That's the binder burning away from the clay. And during that flaming portion is when the piece actually shrinks. Once the flames have stopped, we're going to continue with the torch, bring this piece up to a dull red glow, and that's when I start my timer. Now kids, this is really important because if you underfire your PMC piece, it's going to be brittle and it's going to break. So we're actually going to be doing this in real time so you can see actually how long it's going to take. Okay, let's get started. All right, now to get started, we've dimmed the lights a little bit so you'll have an easier time seeing the flame of the torch. I'm going to rotate the valve on my torch and click it on. And you can see the flame here, the flame point right here. This is really the hottest part of your flame. We're actually going to be working about right in here, just in front of that flame. So with the head of the torch, or with the flame, I'm going to start to circle the piece with the heat. Now, you really want to make sure that your piece has completely dried, because if your piece is not completely dry and you start to heat it up, the moisture is going to want to escape somehow, and usually it'll escape through a little eruption in your clay. So please make sure before we start to fire that your pieces are dry. You can see our piece is starting to smoke, and remember how I talked about how this was going to flame? Well, it's not going to combust into huge flames, kids, but it is going to start to burn. Now, as we're sweeping the torch around the piece, this is really mimicking the process that happens in the kiln. The piece starts to burn, or rather starts to smoke, and then it's going to start to flame. We're almost there. I'm keeping the flame tip, or the torch tip rather, just above my piece of PMC, and you'll notice the flames coming up. Can you see that? There we go. And you're just going to keep the torch on it through the flaming process, and you can also see that it's starting to shrink. I avoid putting the torch right on the clay at this point. But now, once the flames have extinguished, I'm actually going to start sweeping the torch along the piece to heat it. Now, this is the critical stage. I really want to see a dull red glow before I start my timer. And since this piece has stones, the stones are going to really help us see when the piece is hot enough. You can see I'm starting to get that glow. And notice how I'm not moving my torch really frantically. I'm just being slow and deliberate, but I am keeping the torch moving. So I've achieved my glow. I've started that timer at 2 minutes, and we're going to keep this glowing for the full 2 minutes. Now, a couple of tips when it's at this stage. You can see our piece is curling up just a little bit. That's really from the moisture, or not the moisture, but the clay actually shrinking. It shrunk and lifted just a little bit. But the piece, it's actually going to go down as we continue to fire it. You can overfire your piece, and if you're moving your torch too slowly and you let the torch rest in one place, you might start to melt your metal, because now this piece is no longer clay. Once that flame appears, the clay is all burnt out, and this is fine silver now. So we want to keep the torch moving. If you see a flash of silver by your torch, remove your torch quickly, because that means that your piece is starting to melt. But you can see I'm just keeping it even. If I feel like I'm getting a little too hot, and let's get this piece a little hotter so you can see what I mean by too hot. It starts to actually get pretty darn red. I would pull my torch back, let it settle for just a moment, and then get back in there with my torch. Keep moving your torch evenly. Remember, metal conducts heat, so we want to keep the piece as evenly heated as possible. You don't want to concentrate on just one end. We want to make sure we're going up and down the whole piece from end to end. And you can really see those stones glow, which is a good indicator. And you can see that the piece has settled back down. Anything that kind of curled up in the process has laid back down flat. And this process is just about done. Look at that. I'm going to turn off my timer. That was 2 minutes. Maybe give it one last little hit for good luck. Turn your torch off, and we're going to let that cool. Now you can see it's starting to cool pretty rapidly, but we were really on there for quite some time with the torch. So kids, this is pretty hot, so you do not want to touch your PMC. We want to make sure that we let this cool naturally rather than quenching it in a bowl of water. If we quenched it in a bowl of water, these stones would crack due to thermal shock. Okay, so regardless of how you fired your pieces, whether in the kiln or with the torch, the finishing process is the same. Here is our fired pendant, and you can hear sounds like metal. Now, some people like to say that it has a white coating after it's fired. The white that you see isn't actually a coating. The white that you see is actually silver, but it just hasn't been polished yet. So we're going to begin to polish our piece, and we're going to start using a wire brush. And the wire brush, you can see I'm just going to rub it against my metal, and we're not removing any residue. We're just compacting the surface down to start to bring up some shine.
Cut for a second. I need to see that.
Actually, I'm going to do.
I want to see the silver.
And I'm just going to, after that, I'm going to move this around and polish it up.
Can you look in there?
You can grab something black real quick and just say, you know, we're back into supply, so you can see the contrast real quick and then continue. Does that work?
You can't see the contrast. Can I try something like this?
Does it work with our blue card?
No, then it makes everything like
Crazy blue, crazy blue.
I just don't think you're going to be able to see it.
Well, and it's going to shine up more, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, ready?
Mm-hmm.
And action.
So we're going to continue polishing with the brush, and it may be a little difficult for you to see on the screen, but as we start to bring up more shine and more contrast, it's going to be a little bit easier for you to see. Now, this bristled brush is fairly soft, the bristles on here, so it's not marking or scratching our piece in any way, but it is the first step in the polishing process. I'm going to get the sides. You can also substitute steel wool, a really fine grade of steel wool for this step. Now, we can leave it just as is, but for some contrast, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about how to antique this piece. I have a bowl of hot water here, and I'm going to use a nugget of liver of sulfur. Liver of sulfur is a naturally occurring sulfur that will oxidize your piece. So I place this piece, is about the size of a dime, into my bowl of hot water. Your water does need to be hot so that the liver of sulfur will dissolve. So we're going to dissolve that piece. And liver of sulfur does have a certain special odor to it, so it is going to smell a little bit like sulfur. And the way that you, while this is while this is melting in here. The way that you would want to keep liver of sulfur is I would get an old jar, like a pickle jar or something that has a lid, and you can keep this in your pickle jar, and every time you need to use it, set it on top of your coffee warmer, warm it up a little bit, and then you'll be able to dip your pieces in. Once you're finished, put the lid back on the jar and store it wherever you'd store your other hazardous materials. Okay, so this is all ready. I'm going to use my tongs. If you're doing this by hand, you may want to wear some protective gloves, some plastic gloves. So you can see I've just dipped it twice, and this liver of sulfur, since it's fresh and pretty warm, the color is going pretty quick. So we could just rinse this as is and keep this nice kind of iridescent color on the piece, but we're going to actually take this all the way down to dark. So I'm going to dip it another couple of times. If your liver of sulfur is cold, or if it's a little bit older, it may not work quite as quickly, but you can see the graduation of color that I'm getting in this piece. Some people also, instead of heating their liver of sulfur, they actually heat the piece up. So you could take this back to the torch, heat it up just slightly so it's not, you know, it's not burning hot, but just so it's nice and warm. Then grab it with your tweezers and dip it in your liver of sulfur, and your result should be the same. So I'm going to keep sweeping it through my liver of sulfur. You can see we're getting some nice purple color here. And some people really like this effect, and it's a pretty one, so you can, of course, stop anytime the color is pleasing to you. Let's see what we've got. Okay, I'm going to stop my antiquing at this point. I'm going to get a bowl of just plain clear water, and we're going to rinse. Once I've rinsed it in my clear water, I might take it to the sink and give it a nice rinse under running water. Now I'll actually be able to pick up the piece with my fingers. And we're going to dry this piece on a paper towel. Now, as I said earlier, we could simply leave our piece just as is, but we're going to, for contrast, this is a pro polish pad. This is a polishing pad that's going to shine up some of the high spots on our PMC piece. And depending on how much you press, and how much you rub, you can start to take away some of the antiquing. I like to shine the smooth parts. So I'm going to keep polishing with my Pro Polish pad, and folks, as you're polishing with these pads, you do want to make sure that your piece is completely dry, because if moisture gets on these pads, they get kind of mushy and lose their effectiveness. So let's take a look at what I've polished so far. I've polished it where the bale folds over and here at the flower, and I can just sweep it gently across my leaf if I'd like to bring up some of that detail. I can polish up the sides.
Okay.
If I want to bring up a high polish with my Pro Polish pad, I'm just going to really lightly and rapidly buff. And that's going to give me some more surface shine. And you can continue to do as much handwork on this piece until you're pretty satisfied with the results. And remember, this now is metal. This is fine silver. So the more that you handwork this, the more that you polish it, and of course, the more you wear it, the more beautiful this piece is going to look. So from clay to silver, and it's all ready for you to design. Well, that does it. It was a lot of fun making this video for Beaducation.com. And now that you've learned all about the introduction to PMC, keep an eye out for some more advanced projects that we're going to be putting up. If you have any questions or need to contact us in any way, the information will be at Beaducation.com. So, relax, enjoy, and have a great time working with your PMC. Thanks a lot.